Good evening, everyone. Uh, Welcome you all for the today's program on economic offenses, do's and don'ts for the CA. I request you all to put your hand on the heart and rise for the ICI motto.
य एष सुप्तेषु जाग्रति य एष सुप्तेषु जाग्रति कामं 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 कामपुरुषो पुरुषो निर्मिमाणः निर्मिमाणः तदेव शुक्रं तद्ब्रह्मा तद्ब्रह्मा तदेवामृतमुच्यते तस्मिन् लोकः शतः सर्वे तदूनात्यपि कश्चन एतद्द्वैत 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 एतद्द्वैत
Yes. Uh, we acknowledge the presence of our chairman CA Manish Ji Gadia for the in the webinar with us. I would request Manish Ji to address the gathering.
Thank you, Rahul. CA Sagar Tilak, I will say CA only, even though he is practicing as an advocate. CA Bhavna Radeshwar, coordinator, CA Rahul Daga, coordinator, all my dear friends. Good evening to all. And today we have selected a topic, economic offense, do's and don'ts for a chartered accountant. We have seen that anything if happen to any client or any economic offense happen, so the first target will always be a chartered accountant, and we always get a notice. So हमको डर लगता है कि क्या करना है. We do not know how to protect ourselves. So I discussed all these things with Sagar sir 1 month back, and he said कि we can have a program on this. So after discussing, we have planned this program, and this will be very useful to a chartered accountant in future. Apart from this, WIRC is doing various activities. Some of the activities, then on this 14th November, we are having a box cricket tournament, second box cricket tournament at Andheri Sports Complex, and indoor sports event also. So those members want, they can register themselves. WIRC has also planned a cruise, RRC on a cruise. It will be 8-hour learning also on that cruise from 6th to 8th December. Details are available on WIRC website, and I request members to take the benefit of the same. I also wish all the members in future happy Diwali in advance. We are going to celebrate this festival in the next week, and during this week you should take care of your health, wear mask, and take all the precautions. For taking care of your health, WIRC has tied up with various laboratories as well as hospitals for your blood test and other tests. So we have tied up with Kokilaben Ambani Hospital, Bombay Hospital, Om Lab, Suburban Lab, Modern Wellness. So all these details are also available on website. You can take the benefit at very discounted price. You will get all these things. Apart from that, various programs we are running. WIRC started a portal called Coach for a woman chartered accountant. So where you can register yourself for a job. More than 1,000 women CAs are registered on this portal. We have started for members in industry a series called CEO Speak, where every fourth Saturday of the month on 10 to 1, we are having a chat show with the CEO of a company where he is going to discuss his journey from articleship to CEO. We have also started CFO forum. In last 8 months, WRC has come out with 17 different publications, and all these publications are available for sale. So you can purchase any of the publication and take the benefit of the sale. I will not go into detail of each and every initiative what WRC has taken. But one thing I want to request, and I want your support of all the members. You all are aware that on this 3rd and 4th December, our regional and central council elections are there. And my request to all of you is that first you should go and cast your vote. That is very important. So you should not miss out that. If possible, go and cast your vote on day 1 itself instead of waiting for next day. And another important thing is that you should give as many preferences as you want to. Give the maximum preferences so your vote can be counted and will not get exhausted or will not be wasted. That is important. And whenever you are going for voting, do not go alone. Take your friends, partner, relative along with you, so the maximum number of persons can vote. So my humble request. Thank you very much. Over to you, Rahul.
Now I request CA Bhavna Radeshwar to formally introduce our faculty for today.
Yeah, I take this honor to introduce today's speaker, Advocate Sagar Tilokji. Advocate Sagar Tilok completed his graduation as well as Masters in Commerce from BMCC University of Mumbai, University of Pune. He is also a chartered accountant. He is a fellow member of Institute of Chartered Accountants of India. He has completed his graduation in law from Yashwantrao Chauhan Law College, Pune. After practicing as a chartered accountant for over 12 years, he entered the legal profession to practice as an advocate. He specialized in the area of economic offences, including Prevention of Money Laundering Act, Benami Act, Prevention of Corruption Act, etc. He appears regularly before session courts, special ED courts, Mumbai and Bombay High Court. He has been extensively working in the area of Benami law right from the introduction of Benami Transactions Prohibition Amendment Act 2016. He authored a book, Practical Guide to Prohibition of Benami Property Transactions Act, which is one of the best-selling books in the subject. He has authored several articles for journals and newsletters published by ICAI. He has also written articles for online portals and blogs. Advocate Sagar has been a speaker at various forums of International Fiscal Association, Institute of Chartered Accountants of India, ICSI, Chamber of Tax Consultants, and ILS Law College, and many other forums. So I would like Advocate Sagar Tilokji to start the session.
Thank you, CA Bhavna, and thank you, Manish bhai.
Thank you.
So I hope my screen is presentation is visible right now.
Sir.
Yes, sir, it is visible.
Right. So as Manish bhai mentioned initially about the economic offences laws and the exposure of chartered accountants to these laws, I would say the exposure is twofold. One, that the chartered accountant himself is exposed to these laws, and why he is exposed to these laws is because of the clients of a chartered accountant. So of course there is a possibility from two separate ways. Further, there is a possibility of so it can be handled in two ways. One can be how once the proceedings are initiated by any of the agencies, how to deal with it. But before that, I would say what are the preventive measures. It is very important to understand that how do you prevent the possible consequences, how do you actually mitigate the possible risks. That is very important. So after working or rather practicing as a chartered accountant for good 12 years before joining the bar, I got ample experience of working on the audit, tax, advisory functions, And since working as an advocate, practicing as an advocate, and working on the economic offense laws matters, I actually experienced where and how we chartered accountants are exposed to various risks under various laws, under the economic offenses laws. So today we will actually see how and where we are exposed. And the primary reason that I could experience was that because of the lack of awareness about the various new laws and the possible consequences, as well as inexperience about dealing with the agencies regulating these laws. So in today's sessions, we will primarily discuss about these 4 laws: prevention of Prohibition of Benami Property Transactions Act, Prevention of Money Laundering Act, Companies Act, and Income Tax Act. Out of these 4 acts, we will spend less time on the Companies Act and Income Tax Act, as working as a chartered accountant, we always have more than adequate experience about these laws. But we will actually discuss as to how and where we are exposed because of the clients or because of the services that we render as chartered accountants. We'll discuss about the Prevention of Money Laundering Act, and we'll allocate more time to the Benami Property Transactions Act, for the simple reason that it is the newly introduced law. The proceedings were initiated a few years back, but the trials are about to begin under this act, and there are so many notices issued to the clients, and we have seen chartered accountants approaching to various notices, summonses, and proceedings under this act only the way they handle the scrutiny assessment under Income Tax Act, and that is not the correct approach in my opinion. So before we go into that, what to do and what not to do, we will discuss the key provisions of all these laws which are affecting us and our clients. And during the discussion itself, all of you will have the fair idea as to what are the different pitfalls to be avoided. So about the Prohibition of Benami Properties Transactions Act, before we go to the provisions of the law, at a conceptual level, what is Benami transaction is, where say as shown in the presentation, Mr. A, who is a real owner, who pays the consideration to the seller Mr. X. So in the normal process, Mr. X should have transferred the property in the name of Mr. A, who has paid the consideration. But instead of transferring property in the name of Mr. A, if Mr. X transfers property in the name of Mr. B at the instructions of Mr. A, in that case, the person making payment of consideration and the person in whose name the property is transferred, that is Mr. B, are 2 different persons. So this is the basic condition which gives rise to the Benami transaction. There are different parameters mentioned in the law, but overall at a conceptual level, the person who makes the payment of consideration and the person in whose name the property is transferred, when these 2 persons are different, as a checkpoint, you should be vigilant about there is exposure to the Benami transaction. So at conceptual level, this is what the Benami transaction is. So the Benami transaction for the first time was introduced in year 1988, and now we have amended Benami law in 2016. So these are the key differences between the 2 laws. One, in 1988 law there were just 9 sections, whereas as per the amended law we have 72 sections. Actually, in the parliament, the question was asked to the then honorable finance minister Shri Arun Jaitley, as to you already have 1988 law with 9 sections, and now you are inserting so many sections to that 1988 law to make it a 72 sections law. Instead of amending the law, why don't you introduce a fresh law completely? In response to that questions, Shri Arun Jaitley said that if we introduce the new law, then the old law will have to be repealed. That will result into regularizing all the Benami transactions which have already taken place from 1980 to 2016, which we do not intend to do. That's the reason why we are introducing the amendments, and we are introducing the fresh law by way of amendments. So that was his response. So in a way, it indicates that the department or the Benami Prohibition Unit wants to scrutinize the transactions even before 2016, and which they are actually doing. As per 1988 Act, there was acquisition of property as a consequence. The Benami property used to be acquired by the regulators, whereas as per the amended Act, the provision says the property will be confiscated. Rightly so, because entering into Benami transaction itself is illegal. Then the consequence has to be confiscation, because in case of acquisition, the payment of consideration has to follow. But when parties are entering into illegal transaction, there has to be confiscation and not acquisition. In 1988 law, the rules were not notified, so there was no procedure defined. But for 2016, we have the rules notified. So the procedures are very well defined. For 1988 law, the biggest problem was that for any statute, you need regulators, administrators to regulate that law. For 1988 law, the administrators were not defined in the Act. But in 2016 Amendment Act, the administrators are very well defined. We'll see those administrators at a later stage. Of course, there is difference in punishment. There was imprisonment up to 3 years or fine or both. That is how the typical penal provisions in Indian statutes have been. But in the amended act, it says that rigorous imprisonment for a period not less than 1 year and fine. It doesn't talk about or. So the consequence would be punishment as well as penalty. We'll discuss the key definitions of Benami Act. Definition of property. So there is a usual misconception that the Benami law is all about immovable property. It is just to tap and identify, scrutinize the transactions pertaining to land or any immovable property. But if you look at the definition of property, you would understand how wide the scope of this act is. It says that the property include assets of any kind, whether movable, immovable, tangible or intangible, corporeal, incorporeal, and includes any right or interest or legal documents or instruments evidencing title to or interest in the property, and where the property is capable of conversion into some other form, then the property in the converted form, and also includes the proceeds from the property. So in nutshell, it includes anything and everything under the sun. It includes movable as well as immovable properties, tangible, intangible properties, and it also includes even the rights in the property or the legal documents. There is an important wording at the end of the definition which says that also includes the proceeds from the property. So if there is a property, then the proceeds from that property will also be considered as a property. Why it is significant? We'll understand this in the next definition of Benami property. It says that any property which is the subject matter of a Benami transaction and also includes the proceeds from such property. So once some property is considered as a Benami property, then suppose that property is disposed, then consideration received on sale of that property will also be considered as a Benami property. So that is, it has far-reaching implications in the practice. So it is Benami transaction definition. It's the soul of the act. So it has 4 limbs: 29A, B, C, and D. We will read the A first. It says a transaction or an arrangement. So neither the word transaction nor an arrangement is defined under the act. But if you look at the dictionary meaning, the transaction means the event when actual buying and selling takes place, and an arrangement is the word which is the stage preceding the stage of transaction. Say joint development agreements are entered today, but the actual exchange of property, buying, selling of the property, or the developer hands over the property to the joint venture, other party in the joint venture at the end of the transaction. So the transaction takes place at a later date, but today they enter into an arrangement. So the lawmakers want to include transaction as well as arrangement in under the scope of this act. It says that where a property is transferred to or held by a person, and consideration for such property has been provided or paid by another person. So let us call it a payment test. As I explained initially, one person makes a payment and the property is transferred in the name of someone else. But is that the only condition? No, this is just one of the 2 conditions. So let us call it a payment test. It has to be satisfied. And second test is also to be satisfied, which says that the property is held for the immediate or future benefit, direct or indirect, of the person who has provided the consideration. So the person who has paid the consideration shall be deriving some benefit out of the property. So this is called as a, let us call it as a benefit test. So in order to consider the transaction as a Benami transaction, payment test as well as the benefit test will have to be satisfied. Merely on the basis of a fact that a person has made a payment and property is acquired in the name of someone else will not make it a Benami transaction unless it is shown that the person who has made the payment of consideration is deriving some benefit out of the property. So these two conditions are necessary, but still it does not mean that all who satisfy all the transactions which satisfy both the conditions will attract the Benami Act. No, there are certain exceptions. The first exception, that suppose HUF has paid the consideration and acquired a property in the name of Karta or member of HUF, and the property is acquired for the benefit of HUF, then it is not a Benami transaction. Second, a person standing in a fiduciary capacity. Suppose company acquires property in the name of director, trust acquires property in the name of trustee, or partnership firm acquires property in the name of a partner. These are the persons who stand in the fiduciary capacity for these entities. If these entities make payment and acquire property in the name of these persons who are in the fiduciary capacity, then it is not a Benami transaction. Any person being an individual, if he acquires property in the name of spouse or child and the property is acquired out of known sources, in that case it is not a Benami property. As per 1988 Act, the condition was that, the exception was that if the property is acquired in the name of wife or unmarried daughter, then it was not a Benami transaction. But it is correctly amended to widen the scope. Otherwise, the wife acquiring property in the name of husband or any of them acquiring property in the name of son was not considered as an exception under the old law. So the new law has expanded the scope or the eligibility for this exception, and so property acquired in the name of spouse as well as any child of such individual is exception to the Benami transaction. Of course, there is a rider that property has to be acquired out of the known sources. The last exception says that any person in the name of brother, sister, lineal ascendant, descendant as a joint owner. So suppose person acquires property in the name of parents or brother, sister. In that case, and if that property has to be acquired jointly out of the known sources, in that case it will be considered as an exception to the Benami transaction. So I'll just make a mention that I'm talking about acquiring property out of the known sources. Surprisingly, this rider of known sources is missing in the second exception of a person standing in the fiduciary capacity. The exception does not say that that entity acquiring property in the name of person standing in the fiduciary capacity has to acquire the property out of the known sources. Surprisingly, that condition is missing, and that in most probably it will defeat the purpose of this law to great extent. Because some undisclosed income or undisclosed funds are there with the trust or say the company, and if they have acquired a property in the name of director or trustee, still that will not be Benami transaction. Limb B, it says that a transaction or an arrangement in respect of a property carried out or made in a fictitious name. So you know, when the computerization of the lands record was started, it was found that while updating 712 extracts in the system, it was found that there were hectares of land which were acquired in the name of the persons in the villages who never existed. So this limb B takes care of that situation where a transaction or an arrangement is in the name of the person who is fictitious person, means the person who does not exist. Limb C, it is about a transaction or an arrangement in respect of a property where the owner of the property is not aware of or denies knowledge of such ownership. So typically it covers a situation where Benamidar is questioned and he may say that I am unable to prove the source of this source for acquiring this property. This belongs to someone else who is not traceable, or in that case he may say that I am not even aware of the fact that I am owner of this property. It has happened in several cases that the shares of a company, large company, are found in the name of the servants or drivers of few people who did not even have the basic the basic income. Those people say that we were not even aware that these shares of this company to this volume are in our name. So if that is the case, then it will be covered by limb C. And limb D is about transaction or arrangement in respect of a property where the person providing the consideration is not traceable. Limb B is about where the Benamidar is fictitious. Limb D takes care where the beneficial owner or the person who has actually paid the consideration to acquire the property is not traceable or fictitious. So about the consequences. So how the legality or illegality is mentioned under the Act. So Section 3, Clause A primarily is the prohibition section, which says that whoever enters into Benami, so no person shall enter into any Benami transaction. So Clause A makes it illegal. Clause B says that whoever enters into Benami transaction will be punishable with an imprisonment which is extended up to 3 years or fine or both. So as I said, that is clause from 1988. That is to cover the transactions between period 1980 to 2016. And clause C, which is applicable as per the amended Act, it says that whoever enters into any Benami transaction on and after the date of commencement of the Act, Amendment Act, shall be punishable in accordance with provisions of content of Chapter 7. So we'll look at Chapter 7 later, but that is how the scheme of the Act is. It prohibits entering into Benami transaction as per clause A. It punishes as per clause B for the transactions before the Amendment Act, and it punishes as per Chapter 7 for the post-Amendment Act. Section 5 is a confiscation section. So once, what are the consequences? As I said, Chapter 7 will deal with the punishments and penalties, but what happens to the property which is a Benami property? So Section 5 says that the Benami property will be confiscated by the central government. So confiscation is the consequence as far as that property is concerned. Section 6 is very interesting. Suppose someone has already entered into Benami transaction. For a moment, let us assume that someone has paid the consideration and acquired a property in the name of Benamidar, when he is maybe holding a public office, and subsequently if he wants, typically he wants the property to be transferred back in his own name. So Section 6 actually restricts this transaction of transferring property back from Benamidar to the beneficial owner. It says that no such transfer is allowed from Benamidar to the beneficial owner. And if you enter into such retransfer of property, then that retransfer will be considered as null and void. So I'll take a pause here to mention that as you have seen from the definition of Benami property, once it is a Benami property, then if it is sold, then proceeds from that property will again be Benami property. Say for example, a residential house was Benami property acquired in the name of some other Benamidar, and subsequently if beneficial owner sells it, the proceeds from that are parked in fixed deposit. In that case, those fixed deposits will also be considered as a Benami property. That is one consequence, one situation. Secondly, that property will get confiscated. And thirdly, if you attempt to retransfer it, even if you retransfer it, that transaction will be null and void. So for us chartered accountants, it is very important while advising clients on any new transaction for acquiring any kind of property, as we have seen the definition of property, that once it is a Benami property, then it is going to be a Benami property forever. There is no scope for any kind of rectification or reversal of transaction. So it actually indicates, or rather I would say it is an alarming provision for us chartered accountants to actually be careful while advising any clients with respect to acquisition of property. Because if any sort of wrong advice is given at the time of acquisition of property out of ignorance about provisions of this law, and if at all that transaction turns out to be Benami, then there is no way out, because that property will always be Benami property. So as I said, there are authorities defined under the Act. Who are the authorities? The initiating officer is Assistant Commissioner or Deputy Commissioner of Income Tax. Approving authority is Additional Commissioner of Income Tax. Administrator is Income Tax Officer. Adjudicating authority as well as Appellate Tribunal. So this is the mechanism. So government has appointed 24 Benami prohibition units across India. So those are BPUs, and in short, they are nothing but that is a team from the investigation wing of Income Tax Department who are given the jurisdiction of the Benami Act, and initiating officer initiates the proceedings with the approval of the approving authority. So these are the authorities who will regulate the law. So what are the powers of the authority? I'll first start with Section 19. This is very important for us chartered accountants. What are the powers of this authority? Say initiating officer. Section 19 of the Act is about powers of the authority. To tell you the powers, there are various powers. In short, those are the powers of the civil code. And for us, most important is under section 19, the initiating officer or any authority under the Benami Act is empowered to issue summons and record statement under oath. So that officer is empowered to administer oath and record statement under oath. So this is significant provision. This is very much important. It also says that the proceedings before these authorities are the judicial proceedings. So just for us chartered accountants, easier to understand, statement recorded during survey under section 133A and statement recorded during the search under section 132(4). We know that the officer is not empowered to administer oath while recording statement under section 133A survey. So that statement can be retracted. Whereas a statement recorded under oath, where the officer is empowered to administer oath under section 132 subsection 4, that statement cannot be retracted, or I would say it is difficult to retract because that is recorded under oath. So similar power is there with the initiating officer. So as a chartered accountant, if you are accompanying either Benamidar, beneficial owner, or any party in the Benami proceedings, be extremely careful, be very well prepared while recording the statement, because those are judicial proceedings and that statement will be under oath. So typically the process goes, the initiating officer obtains approval of the approving authority to initiate the proceedings. There need not be any reason to believe for him to initiate the inquiry. Section 23 does not require anything of that sort. I have seen situation where, representatives, chartered accountants approaching the IO and asking for reasons to conduct the inquiry. IO does not require any reasons to believe, and further no recording of reasons to believe in order to initiate the inquiry. Whereas on obtaining the information and going through the documents, details and information, he can issue show cause notice only after recording the reasons in writing. He should have reasons to believe. So he issues the show cause notice, and within 90 days, he passes the order. Rather, he is not empowered. Initiating officer is not empowered to decide whether it is a Benami transaction or not. But he builds the case, he compiles the documentation, and he refers matter to the adjudicating authority for adjudication, which actually decides whether it is a Benami transaction or not. But during the proceedings, initiating officer attaches the property provisionally in order to protect the interest of the government, of course. So IO refers the matters for adjudication, and then adjudicating authority issues the notice. So adjudicating authority issues notice to all the parties, all the related parties. Everyone is given opportunity of being heard, and that order has to be passed within a period of 1 year after giving opportunity of being heard to everyone. So this is the stage where the adjudicating authority may decide that this is not a Benami transaction. So provisional attachment goes away and the matter ends there. But in practice, what I have seen, at least I have not come across a case where adjudicating authority has decided that it is not a Benami transaction, so let's stop the proceedings. Adjudicating authority confirms the provisional attachment, so they confirms the attachment and they consider that it is a Benami transaction. So first opportunity where practically we get the opportunity of being heard is before the appellate tribunal. But in the meantime, if we go in appeal before the appellate tribunal, then matter stops there as far as the confiscation of property is concerned, because we go in appeal. At the same time, confiscation proceedings are separate. Before the property is confiscated, adjudicating authority has to again issue the notice, conduct the confiscation hearing, matter is to be heard separately, and then order is to be passed. And once the confiscation is done, the property vests with the central government. Here the issue is that it is quite likely that property is in possession of a third party. It may not be in the possession of the beneficial owner, it may not be in the possession of the Benamidar, but maybe in possession of third person. In order to protect interest of a third person, there is a provision. It says that suppose Benamidar has sold the property, then there are conditions. If that transfer or that sale satisfies certain conditions, like that transfer has happened before the show cause notice was issued, and that transfer has happened at a fair market value, in that case the interest of the bona fide buyer is protected. So there is provision to that effect. Now if it is a Benami property, then confiscation proceedings are initiated. The administrator, who is like a tax recovery officer, TRO, similarly here administrator under the Benami Act, he issues notice to hand over the possession of the property, and 7 days time is given, and if the possession is not handed over peacefully, then he is empowered to take the forceful possession of the property. As I said, the opportunity of being heard practically first time gets before the appellate tribunal. So any party aggrieved by the order of the adjudicating authority may approach the appellate tribunal. So for example, suppose adjudicating authority passes the order that this is not a Benami transaction and the provisional attachment goes away. In that case, even the initiating officer can file appeal before the appellate tribunal. So appellate tribunal hears the matter, and the directory or recommendatory timelines given is 1 year from the end of the month in which the appeal is filed. And against the order of the appellate tribunal, one has to go to the High Court within 60 days. So in all these proceedings, it is important to understand that these are the proceedings with respect to the property attachment. So this, I would say, there are two streams of proceedings which will go as far as Benami is concerned, because one stream deals with, it is a Benami transaction, so properties to be attached, attachment is to be confirmed, then appellate tribunal will hear the matter with respect to the attachment of property, and in order to decide the matter on merits, they will listen the merits also, but that will be related to the attachment of the property or the confiscation of the property, whereas the real punishment and penalty matter will go in trial. Similarly, in case of Prevention of Money Laundering Act, PMLA, ED is the regulating authority which deals and refers matter for adjudication, and from adjudication we go to the appellate tribunal, but they deal with the attachment, confiscation, release of property, whereas the real trial, where whether the real money laundering has happened or not, arrest, punishment, penalty, all those proceedings take care before the trial court. So that is the reason why there are special courts constituted under the Act. So like PMLA, we have special court under the Benami Act. So those Benami trial courts proceedings have recently begun, but that will be the second stream where the punishment proceedings will be taken care of. So what are the consequences and punishment under the Benami Act? Section 53 deals with that. This is important for the clients as well as for the advisors, chartered accountants. It says that they have mentioned three conditions, three circumstances under which there will be prosecution. It says that if the Benami transaction is entered, okay, Benami transaction is entered, but for what purposes? If it is entered to defeat provision of any law, if it is entered to avoid payment of statutory dues, or it is entered to avoid payment to creditors. If any of these three purposes are there to enter into Benami transaction, then the prosecution will be lodged and the punishment will be given. So it says that these three conditions will have to be satisfied, and who will be punished in that case? The beneficial owner, Benamidar, and any other person who abets or induces any person to enter into Benami transaction. They shall be guilty of offense of Benami transaction. So it also includes a person who abets or induces. So what abets? What does it mean? We'll deal with it at a later slide when we'll deal with the abatement as an offense under IPC. But abatement, the person who will abet the transaction will also be punished under this section. So what is a punishment? Minimum for a period of 1 year, which may be extended to 7 years, and fine to the extent of 25% of the fair market value of the property. Section 54 says that if false information is knowingly provided during the proceedings, in that case, there will be penalty to the extent of 10% of the fair market value, as well as punishment for a minimum period of 6 months, which may be extended to 5 years for the providing false information during the proceedings. Now, how about the prosecution? How and when the prosecution start? Initially, when 2016 Amended Act was introduced, there was a provision that no prosecution to be lodged unless it is approved by the board. Board means CBDT. However, last year in 2019, when the Act is amended, the amendment says that with the prior approval of the competent authority, prosecution can be lodged, and it says that the competent authority is commissioner, principal commissioner, director, and principal director of income tax. So now the sanction process is simplified because special courts are constituted and they're about to launch a prosecution, and in many cases prosecution has already been launched. So they do not require going to the CBDT for every sanction, prior sanction, but yes, they require. So as I mentioned, now the trials under Benami Act has begun. So for Maharashtra, I think even for Pune and all these districts, the special court is in Bombay, which will be special court under Benami Act. They have received recently many complaints which were filed. Are now the court has started taking cognizance. They have started issuing summons for appearances, and the trial has recently begun. See, we all have seen the trials under the Prevention of Money Laundering Act. Typically, we know how the adjudicating authority and the appellate tribunal goes, and the real trial court actually decides whether it is money laundering or not. But under Benami Act also, there are similar provisions and similar procedures, and similar trial will be held by special Benami court. So, which has such trials have recently begun. So, the key factor is about the burden of proof. So who will decide and who will actually prove it is Benami, or whether the parties will have to prove that it is not Benami? See, the act is silent about it as far as Benami Act is concerned. But if we look at the Evidence Act, the burden of proof is always on the party that asserts the affirmative. So the onus of proof will keep on shifting during the trial from one party to another. But ultimate burden will be on the party that asserts the affirmative. In case of a Benami transaction, the Benami Prohibition Unit or the initiating officer will assert the affirmative. It means BPU initiating officer will say that it is a Benami transaction. So the burden will be on IO to prove that it is a Benami transaction and not the other way around. So burden of proof will be on the initiating officer to prove that it is a Benami transaction. As far as the admissibility of evidence is concerned, I would say, as I said, the proceedings as per section 19 before the authority, which includes the initiating officer, of course, are the judicial proceedings. So being the judicial proceedings, the Evidence Act is applicable, and whatever Evidence Act is applicable, and any submission made to the authority or statement recorded will be admissible in the evidence. Now moving to the Prevention of Money Laundering Act after the Benami Act. We'll deal with the key provisions which actually are of relevance to us. Section 3 is I would say, a charging section. It says that whoever directly or indirectly attempts to indulge or knowingly assists or knowingly is a party or is actually involved in any process or activity connected with the proceeds of crime, including its concealment, possession, acquisition or use, and projecting or claiming it as untenanted property, shall be guilty of offense of money laundering. So what we can understand is any person who is directly, indirectly indulged or involved in the process relating to the proceeds of crime. So proceeds of crime is the essence of this definition. So there has to be proceeds of crime, which are the tainted proceeds, and the person shall attempt or be involved in showing those proceeds, which are tainted proceeds, as untainted proceeds. So the actual offense of money laundering is an attempt of showing those tainted proceeds as untainted proceeds. But what is tainted proceeds? It means those should be the proceeds of crime. So what is proceeds of crime is important, which is defined under section 2(1) subsection clause U, which are proceeds of crime. So proceeds of crime says that the proceeds derived or obtained, in nutshell, proceeds derived or obtained out of the criminal activity relating to the scheduled offense. So it takes us, there is a schedule A to the Prevention of Money Laundering Act, and there are around 29 acts which are given under that schedule. Earlier there were 28 acts, but now 29th act added is a Companies Act. And it's not that all the sections of those scheduled acts are scheduled per se. They have given 29 acts, and under those acts particular provisions are mentioned which are the scheduled offenses. So there are 29 acts which are the scheduled offenses. So to understand and again decoding the definition of what is money laundering and what actually is the offense under PMLA is, there has to be the criminal activity relating to the scheduled offense. So say Indian Penal Code, IPC, NDPS, all these acts are scheduled offenses, SEBI, FEMA. So there should be some proceeds generated out of the criminal activity relating to the scheduled offense. Then those proceeds of crime, if those are attempted to be shown as untainted, then that is offense of money laundering under section 3 of PMLA. So it is necessary to have the scheduled offense. What is the punishment for money laundering? So whoever commits the offense of money laundering shall be punishable with rigorous imprisonment for a term which shall not be less than 3 years and extended to 7 years, and also the fine. So this is the consequence of entering into any money laundering activity. Now I'm just taking you to certain important aspects of the scheduled offense where we as a chartered accountants are mostly exposed to because of the clients and because of our role while rendering the services, and I'll take you to that. So of course, out of the scheduled offenses, 29 scheduled offenses, first act is Indian Penal Code, and there are various sections which are mentioned under the Indian Penal Code as a scheduled offense. One of that which is affecting most to the chartered accountants is 120B, criminal conspiracy, which is defined under section 120A of the Indian Penal Code. The definition simply says that when two or more persons agree to do or cause to be done an illegal act or an act which is not illegal by illegal means, such an agreement is designated a criminal conspiracy. So please understand, I'll just take a pause here. So usually any crime requires an act, but this definition as far as the criminal conspiracy is, it says mere agreement amounts to an offense. Meeting of minds is important for 120A. It says that when two or more persons agree to commit an illegal act or an act which is not illegal, but if that is committed by illegal means, in that case that agreement, mere agreement, will amount to the criminal conspiracy. So 120B is invoked. How it bothers us? We'll see the case studies towards the end, where we'll take the practical examples and cases how we as chartered accountants are exposed to this. But for now, 120B, as I said, it requires, there has to be illegal act or act which is not illegal but by illegal means. But does it really require act? No. Mere agreement between, if two parties agree to do something, then it is a criminal conspiracy. Now I have mentioned here DK Shivkumar versus Enforcement Directorate judgment. I will quickly mention how this judgment is important and alarming for us chartered accountants. A search was conducted maybe 2-3 years back at the premises of DK Shivkumar in Karnataka, and some incriminating material including cash, papers, documents were found allegedly worth 143 crores. And Income Tax Department immediately filed the prosecution complaint, and in that complaint they included section 277A was invoked of the Income Tax Act, and along with that section 120B was charged. So Income Tax Department, while filing a prosecution complaint, added section 120B of IPC. Now what was the catch? Once that 120B was added by the Income Tax Department in the prosecution complaint, 120B Income Tax Act is not one of the scheduled offenses under PMLA. So if anything goes wrong as far as the Income Tax Act is concerned, Enforcement Directorate does not get the jurisdiction. So suppose if any incriminating material is found, any undisclosed income is found under the Income Tax Act, then as we know, the typical search proceedings go on, then penalty, even prosecution under income tax. But it does not give any jurisdiction to the Enforcement Directorate under PMLA. But Income Tax Department invokes section 120B because there were certain documents or transactions were found, and Income Tax Department thought that these are carried out by two or more persons. They agreed to do this act, so they invoked 120B of IPC as a criminal conspiracy. So 120B of IPC, criminal conspiracy, is the scheduled offense under PMLA. So immediately Enforcement Directorate got the jurisdiction and they issued a summons. That summons was challenged before Honorable Karnataka High Court by DK Shivkumar. Ultimately, that was also a 226 petition, and of course the bail was there was a prayer for bail, so bail was granted. But the argument made during the hearing was that 120B is the scheduled offense, but Income Tax Act itself is not the scheduled offense. But whether the conspiracy 120B is an independent offense without the predicate offense. So overall, on that basis, it was prayed to quash the summons issued by the Enforcement Directorate, but court did not do that. So 120B is treated as an independent offense. So two or more persons coming together to commit an act which is an offense under the Income Tax Act, which is not a scheduled offense, but still being two or more persons agree to do that, it gives rise to the criminal conspiracy 120B, which is a scheduled offense. So it attracts PMLA as well as it gives jurisdiction to the Enforcement Directorate. That is the consequence. I mentioned about the word abet used in the Benami law. So do we really understand what the abatement means? I will not go into too many legalities, but there are three different circumstances which gives rise to the offense of abatement. Three things, three actions indicate the offense of abatement. One is instigation. If you instigate a person, typically it comes into picture in case of offense against the body. So this is not relevant for our today's discussion. So second is about the conspiracy, the persons engaged in the conspiracy, but 120B takes care of it. But the third element is important for us, which says that intentionally aids by an act or illegal omission the doing of that thing. So we as an advisor have advised certain transaction to be structured in such a way for any other purpose. It may not be to bypass any particular law, but even as a tax planning mechanism, if we advise certain structure and we say that if we carry out this, then this can be done. And tomorrow, suppose if we have advice on some international tax structure, and tomorrow some GAR provisions are applicable and it becomes as a not legal transaction. In that case, who has advised the transaction? So we have aided, we have executed, we have advised, as well as we might have helped or assisted in implementation of that structure also. So it may give rise to the exposure to the chartered accountant advising on that under the third limb of section 107 abatement under the IPC. So we shall be very careful. I'll just deal with this, how to mitigate that risk at a later stage. But there is exposure to abatement also along with the criminal conspiracy. So this was about the PMLA as well as IPC. Now coming to the Companies Act. In the new Companies Act, section 447, we have fraud. I won't read the entire definition of fraud, what it includes and what it does not include. The alarming element is that section 447 of Companies Act has been recently introduced as a scheduled offense under PMLA as 29th Act under the schedule. As per the earlier PMLA, there were 28 scheduled offenses or acts, but Companies Act was not there. But now Companies Act is added as a 29th Act under the schedule with just one section as an offense, scheduled offense, and that is 447, punishment for fraud. We are already aware that there is a regulator or investigating authority defined under the Companies Act, which is Serious Fraud Investigation Office, SFIO, who investigates and deal with that. But they will deal with this from the Companies Act perspective. But whereas if those out of fraud certain funds are generated and properties are acquired, then SFIO may not get jurisdiction to that. That may be the philosophy for including that 447 as 29th Act under the scheduled offense of PMLA, which gives jurisdiction to ED. So in case of a corporate fraud, the punishments under the Companies Act will be taken care of by SFIO by filing complaint and proceedings, and parallelly the concurrent jurisdiction will be available to the Enforcement Directorate also now, because as per the recent amendment, Companies Act and just one section of fraud is added to the scheduled offense under PMLA. So I will not read the definition, but this is overall the alarming thing is now income tax. We all know that Income Tax Act has provisions which talks about the punishment. So there were provisions, initially when the prosecution thing started, typically for all these years, prosecution always used to be in very sensitive cases where lot of undisclosed income assets were found during the search action. So for those certain approval procedures were carried out and used to prosecute a person, but not the prosecution in general. In case of other undisclosed income or anything, or even non-filing of written prosecution was never used to be lodged. So when actually income tax department started sending the prosecution notices, people thought that these are new provisions newly introduced, but these provisions are there in the act for last 30-35 years, but were never actually explored by the authorities. But in order to control the evasion of tax and concealment of income, they need to be more strict. That is what their philosophy is, and that is the very purpose why they do this. So overall, there are various sections which talks about the punishment. I am dealing with 277A here. Again, I will not read the whole definition, but why it is affecting us, because say falsification of accounts, because we being the auditors, we certify the financials, we express our opinion on the financials, and tomorrow if something wrong is in the financials, then of course now the bell will always ring that 120B is there. But there are certain sections which may not actually affect you directly, but if those sections affect the client, then indirectly that is going to affect you also. So there are various punishment sections under the Income Tax Act, and the most dangerous or draconian provision I would say is 278 capital E, presumption of culpable mental state. So as a basic philosophy of criminology, actus reus and mens rea are the two elements which are necessary to prove any offense. So there has to be a criminal act, as well as mens rea means the guilty mind. So we often see that in criminal cases, act is proved, but guilty mind or mens rea is not proved. Here, income tax, under the Income Tax Act, suppose income tax return is not filed, that is an act, that is an offense. But how otherwise income tax department will prove that there was assessee had intention, or he has willfully not filed the income tax return? So that would have been a regular burden of proof. But in case of Income Tax Act, by 278 capital E, that burden has been shifted from the income tax department to the assessee. This is a reverse burden of proof, because it says that there is a presumption that certain offense is committed, then it shall be presumed that unless contrary is proved, the person or the assessee wanted to, in short, as a presumption of mens rea, in a way you can say. But it is a rebuttable presumption, not an irrebutable presumption, because it says that the assessee can prove contrary, but that contrary cannot be proved merely by preponderance of probability. That contrary is to be proved beyond all the reasonable doubts. So like in a criminal case, the burden is on the prosecution to prove their case beyond all reasonable doubts. Here, assessee has to prove his innocence beyond all reasonable doubts. So 278E, many may think that how this provision is constitutional and all, but its constitutional validity is already challenged in a couple of cases. Those are really very good judgments. You can read Selvi Jayalalitha judgment of Madras High Court. That's a very good judgment, detailed judgment, which takes care of that. So I would say, draconian provisions as far as these economic offense laws is concerned, with respect to the bail, I'll quickly mention why. And with respect to the presumption of culpable mental state, 278 capital of Income Tax Act, as well as section 54 of Black Money Act, which is identical to 270 of Income Tax Act. Now coming to the bail provisions, why these bail provisions are important, and why am I giving so much of emphasis on the PMLA, Enforcement Directorate, SA5 and Companies Act? See, there is section 45 of PMLA, identical to section 212 subsection 6 of Companies Act, which talks about the bail. So someone is arrested by ED in PMLA matter or SA5 in Companies Act, then the bail can be granted only after complying with these provisions. Section 45 of PMLA is identical to 2126, which says there are dual conditions under these sections. Condition 1, that the prosecutor shall get an opportunity to oppose the bail, which is fair. So as an applicant, we file a bail application, so prosecutor will get an opportunity to oppose the bail, which is fine. The second condition, in short, it says that the court shall record its satisfaction that the person accused is not guilty of the offense for which he is accused. So in short, the court has to record a satisfaction that person is not guilty of the offense accused. So in practice, at a bail stage where the court does not go into the merits of the case, how does court record a satisfaction that the person has not committed the said alleged offense? So that is the reason why getting bail under PMLA or Companies Act is extremely difficult unless that condition is satisfied how come the judge record at the bail stage that the person is not accused of the offense? So these are the two provisions which are extremely draconian to get the bail. There are certain important judgments which you must go through. As I mentioned, Selvi Jalili, the judgment of Madras High Court, which talks about the constitutional validity. It talks why 278 is there, how the presumption, why it is rebutable and all that. So it is a good judgment, it's a good read. Second is about Mahesh Agrawala versus assistant director. So PMLA case. Here the chartered accountant had assisted the client to obtain the loan from bank. He had prepared a loan proposal, he had prepared the projections, and because of that the bank had registered an offense against the chartered accountant, of course, as well as with against the promoters, and the proceedings under PMLA were initiated. The same time, disciplinary committee of ICAI acquitted the chartered accountant, and on that basis that chartered accountant had filed this petition before High Court stating that even the CA body has acquitted him. But however, High Court of course held that the disciplinary committee of ICAI had a different perspective while evaluating your case, and they looked it from more of a professional competence or misconduct point of view. But whereas overall considering the role, it looks serious, and the bail was denied. Similarly, in case of a chartered accountant and financial advisor of YS Jagannath Reddy, was denied a bail by Honorable Supreme Court in case of B. Vijay Sai Reddy versus CBI. This is also a good judgment, just to understand how courts look at the role of a chartered accountant. In that bail application, it was pleaded that he is just a chartered accountant, like he's an advisor. But court looked at all the facts and said that, he was on the board, he was CF of a company. So you cannot merely just take a position that he was just a chartered accountant, but he was not actually, he himself was not involved. There is no wrongful gain. Those arguments were not accepted by Honorable Supreme Court, and the bail was denied. Now we'll quickly go to the case studies. The case study, it says that auditor of a company. See, all these case studies which I have taken, I have around 10 case studies. All these case studies are the real situations which I have come across. Of course, these are sanitized, modified, simplified, just for the sake of academic discussion, and these are not to point out towards any particular case or a person, but this is in the discussion in the academic interest, just to have better clarity with respect to the statutory provisions. So auditor of a company, Mr. A, is present in an audit committee meeting and a board of directors meeting of XYZ Limited. During the meeting, large number of related party transactions at exorbitantly high price were approved. The auditor did not participate in the discussion. Say practically, if you go to the boardroom, there may not always be the watertight compartment between the board meeting and audit committee meeting. Usually, all of them sit together, discuss the matter, and they conclude the meeting, and separate minutes may be prepared at a later stage. When just all these resolutions were passed approving the related party transactions, the chartered accountant was supposed very much present there. He did not participate in the discussion. Later on, the Enforcement Directorate and SFIO, while scrutinizing the XYZ company records, found that the funds were siphoned off out of the company using those related party transactions. These were approved during those meetings where that chartered accountant or the auditor was also present. So how, if you ask the chartered accountant or auditor, he would say that I did not even participate because I was not party to it. It did not bother me. I was just participating for the financial discussion, but he was present at the meeting and where these transactions were carried out. So as an auditor, can we really take a position that, I was silent, I did not participate in the discussion? Does it prove your innocence? So actually, no, your silence amounts to your consent. So whenever you are sitting in a board meeting or audit committee meeting, please be very clear with your opinion. You have two options, I would say. If you are present in the meeting, then you please record your dissent on the points you do not agree. And if you are not in a position to record that dissent, then you please don't remain present in the meeting. Being present in the meeting without recording your dissent but not participating in the discussion is not going to help you. So as an auditor, be very careful wherever you participate in the meeting, particularly where such resolutions are passed, and record is maintained which marks your attendance as present in the meeting. Sometimes they even put like you are invited to the meeting if you are there for the board meeting, but you are not on the board. So be very careful. Again, as a part of do's and don'ts, I would say that be very careful that do check the board meeting minutes or audit committee meeting minutes after you attend the meeting. You typically keep on going and attending the meeting every quarter, but please take a little pain of verifying the minutes of the earlier meeting as a process. So in the second case, a chartered accountant has assisted the real estate company for obtaining project funding from a bank. A case somewhere similar, I would say, to the Mahesh Agrawala case that I just discussed, where a chartered accountant prepared entire proposal, including the projections and the profile of the company, and he gave the presentation before the banker, and some of the loan was sanctioned. Subsequently, the utilization certificate was asked from a chartered accountant, which also he issued. And however, the bank at the advanced stage, being the real estate loan to the real estate company, the bank at a later stage found that the funds were not utilized for the project for which those were granted, but were diverted and used for some other project or purpose. Now bank filed the FIR against the directors, of course, and also against the chartered accountant for the conspiracy. So bank, this is a very common situation, so please don't get surprised with any of this. This is happening in almost all the cases where the bank files case of cheating against a company for diversion of funds. So whenever you issue the utilization certificate or whenever you issue the proposal, please be clear about what your role is, what data is you get from your client, and what value addition you do to it while presenting it. You should be extremely careful while providing this data. Otherwise, bank, in all the cases which I have seen, charges a chartered accountant, or I won't say a CA always, but any consultant who carries out the proposal. The chartered accountant having client X who has regularly paid the advance tax by estimating his income for the year. However, at the end of the year, he realizes that his advance tax is little short than for the actual income. So the same chartered accountant has client Y. So he raises invoice, so that Y client raises invoice on the client X. Client X does the TDS, makes the payment, so which reduces the profit, consequently income, which reduces the further tax liability. So the tax liability fits within the advance tax paid. So that is done. Just on a small scale, on a simplified example, I am telling you. But if it is done on a larger scale, and tomorrow income tax department reads it and finds that that invoice itself is not for the services which are genuinely rendered, this is an accommodation entry, then X and Y will suffer their consequences for sure. But at the same time, both were the clients of a same chartered accountant or auditor advisor, is also going to create a trouble for that chartered accountant also, which has happened, which happens regularly. So again, as I said, it will always ring the bell 120B. So be very careful while dealing with two separate clients, and if they are if you facilitate as a chartered accountant for any of these documentation accommodation entries, then you must refrain from such transactions. You must discourage such transactions. Rather, at least you don't participate yourself or don't facilitate these transactions, because for all these years these things were not so dangerous, but with having so much of reporting, so much of technology, and with so much of agencies with so much of laws as tools in their hands, it's going to be a lot of trouble, and it is a lot of trouble even now. One of the interesting case studies from the Benami Act, I would say, Mr. A intends to purchase a house property from Mr. B. So what happened that see, Mr. A wanted to purchase property from Mr. B. Initially, he initiated talks. Somehow those talks were not successful. Somehow they had some dispute, and Mr. B said that no, I will not sell you this property. So what Mr. B did, what Mr. A, who wanted to purchase a property, did, he asked his friend Mr. C to approach Mr. B to acquire a property. Mr. A said to his friend Mr. C that I will fund you for the entire property, I will pay you the consideration in advance. You acquire that property from Mr. B for me, because he is not going to sell me. You acquire that property. Subsequently, I will buy it back from you. because I am the one who is paying the consideration, because Mr. C did not have those funds. Is it a Benami transaction? So this is a, of course, all these are real cases. This again is a real case. So A, B, C, none of them were aware of the consequences of Benami Act. They did not even know what the Benami Act is. But if you look at the definition, Mr. A is providing consideration to Mr. B to acquire the consideration to Mr. C to acquire property from Mr. B. Once that property is acquired, as per the plan, Mr. A was going to transfer that property from Mr. C to Mr. A. So there is a satisfaction of payment test as well as the benefit test at a future date, because A was going to acquire that property back from Mr. C. So this gives rise to the Benami transaction. And I would say this is a classic Benami case. So while advising clients, do we really, in similar cases, do we really bother to check the implications under the Benami Act? Practically, I have seen no one bothers to check even the implications under the Benami Act. But yes, the transaction is a Benami transaction and it comes under the purview. Just to add little more to it, this is a case where it will be a Benami transaction, but what will be the consequences? As I said, if you can recollect, I mentioned that a prosecution, punishment, penalty under section 53 will be there only if any of the three purposes are satisfied. This transaction is a Benami transaction, but it does not satisfy any of those three purposes: defrauding the creditor, avoiding the payment of statutory dues and all. So none of those three circumstances are met here. So there may not be punishment and penalty. But section 5, which talks about the confiscation, does not have any of these conditions or possibilities or purposes mentioned. So punishment is independent of confiscation. So in this case, typically there may not be punishment or prosecution or penalty, but section 5 is just a one-line section which says that Benami property will be confiscated. So if it is a Benami property, it will be confiscated, but there will not be any punishment penalty. Okay, so here say there were a group of few ladies who came together and who wanted to have a budget home on their own. So what they identified a plot of land, and they decided that we'll buy that plot of land and we'll construct the house of our own. We'll get funding from the bank. However, that plot of land which they identified was an agricultural land, which they were not eligible to purchase. So what they did, they had some social worker in touch with them who really wanted to help them. So what they did, all those ladies along with that social worker formed a company, and they made that social worker director of a company. All the ladies along with that social worker were the shareholders in that company. However, what they did, while acquiring the property, all those ladies funded that social worker, or Mr. A, acquired that agriculture land in the name of Mr. A because he was an agriculturist. And then Mr. A, agriculturist, after acquisition of land, entered into joint development agreement, or he granted all the development rights to that company, where all the ladies were the shareholders, along with that Mr. A also. Here, in this case, no one wants to cheat anybody, but still that is how the transaction was structured. Ideally, those women could have contributed those funds as capital in that company, where they could have purchased the land and they could have developed it themselves. But they did not want to wait till the formation of a company and that piece of land was agriculture, so they purchased it. Now the problem happened when those ladies approached the bank for the loan, and somehow bank suspected that this may be a Benami transaction because the property is acquired by in the name of someone else and was funded by someone else. And finally the project got stuck up and the land was already purchased, the money was paid. So this is like what can be the consequences of Benami property. Again, as I said, once Benami, then Benami forever. There cannot be any way out. This is again an example from Income Tax Act. Search carried out at the premises of Mr. X and certain valuables were found. Now Mr. X says that these valuables, jewelry, that belongs to my wife. Now wife is interrogated separately, her statement is recorded separately. Now if wife records a statement that no, this does not belong to me, that as during the search she thought that she has to deny everything. So she said that no, this does not belong to me, I don't know from where this is from, this does not belong to me. So if you can recall, one of the limbs of the definition of Benami transaction, it says that if the Benamidar denies ownership of the property. So if she says that this I don't own this, then it gives rise to the exposure to the Benami. So it is very important as to how and what the statement is recorded during the search. Now in the similar situation, if say a partnership deed is found where Mrs. X is a partner, now she may deny that, I don't know, I don't even remember, I don't know if I'm a partner in this or not. Then again the same exposure will be there. But at the same time, if the statement is recorded that, I know I'm a partner in a firm, but I may not be able to answer the questions because I don't look after the day-to-day operations of a firm. So she says that she's aware of her ownership, but is not aware of the day-to-day operations. Then this may not be covered under the Benami Act. But denial of ownership amounts to Benami Act. Now this case study again is about, after demonetization, it happened that a lot of influential people went to the slum area, distributed cash. That cash was deposited in different various bank accounts. And subsequently, what happened that those influential people asked them to deposit that cash in their respective accounts, as they did not anyways have any income. And they said that, subsequently we'll take this money back. Now, practically what happened, income tax department sent notices to those account holders. And those account holders were not even, of course, they were not filing return. They had a very, very nominal income. So at a point, they recorded a statement. They may record a statement that, this is, this cash does not belong to us. We may not be able to name the person who has given it to us, but yes, this does not belong to us. In that case, if you again can recollect that this is not this is a Benami transaction, because they may not name the beneficial owner. So the beneficial owner or the real owner may not be traceable, but still there is a Benamidar. So overall, the act has taken care that, they should not, the authorities shall not be trapped in a situation where either of the parties are not available. So still, once the property is identified, then it is a Benami property, even if either of the parties is not available. But again, what will be the consequences in, say, Jan Dhan account cases? These are very common cases which have happened across India. What will be the consequences? Confiscation, penalty, prosecution. So it says that whoever enters into Benami transaction for penalty, prosecution. So whether these people had entered into transaction, say for example, tomorrow in my bank account, somewhere unknown transaction comes, some amount comes. I'm not aware from where it is come. What we typically do, if at all something like this happens, we go to the bank and intimate that I have received this credit. I'm not sure from where this has come. So you please clarify. So sometimes if it happens, then bank rectifies the transaction. But in this case, does it really mean that people entered into transaction? Because in Jan Dhan account cases, there were so many instances where even people were not aware that money has been deposited in their bank accounts. Their bank accounts were just used. So again, there will be two situations: cash handed over to the people and people deposited a cash in their own Jan Dhan account. That will be that situation may be considered as a situation where people entered into transaction. Whereas in other case where Jan Dhan accounts were just identified and without even approaching people, cash was directly deposited in their accounts. In those cases, it may not be the right position to say that these people entered into that transaction. So in that case, the property may get confiscated, but these people may not have to face punishment and penalty. As I said initially, there have been instances where the large amount of shares are found in the name of driver, servant, who have acquired, who say that, we are not even aware of the ownership. So these are, of course, the Benami transaction. Again, the last one, the chartered accountant has provided a service of arranging private equity funding for the client. May not necessarily be through some large size PE fund, but privately equity was arranged. As per the understanding, investor was not going to look after the day-to-day operations. He was like a passive investor. Subsequently, it was found that, very common situation. Subsequently, it was found that investor was arrested in some PMLA case or say Benami case started against him, or typically a PMLA case. So what happens to the entity in which he has invested? So as you know, those are tainted funds. Now you know what are tainted funds generated out of scheduled offenses. So if those funds are tainted and are in your client company, to show as untainted funds. So what happens to that? So how do you mitigate such risk? I would say, please make sure that when you have any private equity funding or any similar transaction, you always have investor agreement. Do you really bother to include a clause which says that the investor undertakes this genuine source and the responsibility of the amount invested in the company? So the way when we acquire a property, we always say that the seller undertakes the genuineness or the clear title to the property. But when we draft or when we wait or when we confirm the investor agreement, or for that matter, I would say not just investor agreement for the private equity investment, even in case of any other property, do we really make sure that there is clause in any and every agreement which results into transfer of property of any sort to say that the seller undertakes that the property is acquired out of his own undisputed funds, sources of funds, untainted funds, and tomorrow if at all something comes, the responsibility is on the seller. So do we really ensure that? As far as I have seen, no. But please, this is again another do's and don'ts, but please take care that you have. After going through all these acts, provisions, practical cases, I would say what are the key takeaways, what are the key do's and don'ts for chartered accountants, we can say. I would say certification assignments is the most sensitive and dangerous assignment to do. This may be simplest, this may be lucrative, but I would say this gives most of the exposure to most of these economic offenses, because at least because of UDIN started by the institute, at least the forged certificates are controlled to great extent. So your signature or the certificate typically used to get forged, that is something which is not going to happen now. But still, what we typically see, certification is taken very casually by us while certifying anything. So usually certificates are given out of the relations with the client, sometimes for fee, or most of the times even without fee if he's a regular client. So that's just a net worth certificate for the banker, or typical just the utilization certificate. Anyway, loan is there in the bank, so utilization certificate is given. So do we really care for what purpose that certificate is going to be used? If it is given to the bank as a utilization certificate, do we really understand what are the possible consequences? We just talked about the other case. So how many of us really prepare even the letter of engagement for certification assignment, defining the scope of certification? How many of us really get the management representation letter even for the certificate? Because in most of the cases, data is given by the client and we are just supposed to verify and certify it as correct. But do we really get a counter certificate stating that this is data given by client to us? Please trust me, we are extremely poor in documenting anything between client and us. We are always particular about documentation which goes from us to the authority, any agency, income tax department, or from client to these agencies. But we are extremely poor as far as the documentation between the client and us is concerned. It's just mentioning a line at the end of the certificate that this is issued for a specific purpose for submitting to the bank is not sufficient. Do you really know what purpose the certificate is submitted to the bank? So please as another do's and don'ts factor, I would say, do draft a letter of engagement even for a certification assignment. Do get a representation letter from the client stating that these are the figures under this, and please get it countersigned by the client. Second factor, management representation letter, MRL. When you sign as an auditor, we take so much of responsibility. Now so many laws are amended. Now we give certificate, audit report even as a true and correct. So why do we and how do we take responsibility of the correctness of the statement? The fairness was okay, true and fair. How do we take the responsibility of the correctness? The stock is taken as certified by the management. Do we really take management representative letters in all cases? If not, please make a practice to have MRL signed from the client with you before you sign the audit report. Client will always be in hurry and emergency to get audit report from you, but please do not sign before you get the MRL, because once you issue the audit report, MRL will always be on a sidetrack and you will take it next year. So unless you have MRL, please don't sign audit report. Get all the things right from secured loans, unsecured loans, stock figures, everything countersigned by the client in the MRL. So letter of engagement, again, as I mentioned, not just for the certification assignments in this case, but in all cases, even in case of advisory. Suppose you are into some international tax advisory or even in the tax advisory. So whenever you submit opinion to the client, you always say what are the relevant laws you have considered. But the same time, as I mentioned some time back, that suppose some international structure is there and some GAR is invoked, or you are not aware of the provision, but some violation of FEMA is done, or tomorrow that you advised for the tax structure, but that activity happened to violate the NBFC norms of RBI, and that's how PMLA comes into picture, or even the bank may file some RBI may file some complaint. So how do you control this? So please have the letter of engagement signed, and please make a mention that the scope of this advisory or opinion is limited only to this act, and the scope does not cover any other statute, because you do not even know that what violation under what statute your advisory is going to create. So be very careful, be very religious, very methodical, and very particular about having the letter of engagement signed before the assignment or before giving the opinion. Bank funding proposal, the most sensitive issue. So projections, preparation of projections is the responsibility of the client. You are presenting it to the bank on behalf of a client. So please be careful, and please be sure that please make sure that you are just representing your client. You are not preparing something on your own. You are presenting what client has prepared. And please don't shy away from saying this even to the banker, that you are representing the client and you are not a client himself. You are taking the whole of the burden on you on behalf of a client, and ultimately you are also made a party to the complaint when the client defaults. So projections, as I said again, the documentation between you and the client, that is very important. So even if you present projections as part of your proposal, please get it signed by the client, at least as a counter proposal. So get counter projections, so get those signed from client to you, and on the basis of that you include, and please make a mention that these are certified by the client and presented as it is. Board meetings and audit committee meetings, as I said, we have already discussed that adequately. Your silence will not be your innocence. You will have to record your dissent. Advisory over phone, this is like a casual nomenclature, I would say, for this bullet, but typically we just get a call from our regular client friend, someone that I'm buying this property, I just have a quick query, I'm doing this, that, so is it okay, shall I do this transaction? What typically everyone does is everyone just verifies you are not depositing cash in the bank account to acquire this property. He says no, I'm doing everything through bank. The moment he says that he is doing everything through bank, you feel like there is nothing to worry, so you say okay, you go ahead, bindas le lena. So that is not the correct approach, because you never know from where the funds have come, and again in whose name he is going to buy. Suppose he is going to buy only property only in the name of his mother, and he is going to reside in the property, then there is exposure to Binami Act, because it requires joint ownership by the person who has paid the consideration and in whose name the property is acquired. There are so many fine prints in these acts, so be very careful. Please avoid just advisory on the phone. What it means, it's not, I just don't want to stop you from the virtual advisory or advisory over a video conferencing, but I mean to say that just stop the casual advisory. You do the transaction, there is nothing to worry. Please don't do that. Accommodation entries, again, as I've mentioned in the case study, do not facilitate, do not participate, do not encourage. Be very careful. Even if you come across a situation, be very careful. Do not document anything. Do not get involved in this kind of transaction at all, I would suggest. Last, recording statements under economic offense laws. So if you are accompanying someone who is summoned under any of these laws, be very careful. Just make sure that you have adequate knowledge about that particular law. What are the consequences if the statement is wrong? So be very careful when the statement is recorded in your presence. I am telling you this out of experience when I have read a few statements which were nothing less than a suicide note before the authority. Like, for an example, I remember reading a statement a couple of years back in the Benami proceedings when someone approached me. He had recorded a statement before coming to me. He was the alleged Benamidar, and he had recorded a statement that, you know, I have just lent my name. Some Mr. X has paid the consideration. He is occupying that property. I have just lent my name. I have done. I am not even enjoying the property. I have not even paid for the property. I have just lent my name. So I am not a Benamidar. So what he himself was admitted was nothing but he was the Benamidar. And when I asked, unfortunately, he said that I recorded this. My CA was very much present with me when I recorded this. So unfortunate incidences have happened. So please be very careful. Wherever you require, you take advice of someone for the client, for yourself, but be very careful while recording statements under these laws, because under all these economic offense laws, these are like admissible proceeding, admissible evidences, and these are judicial proceedings. So be very careful. So in nutshell, just to summarize, and before I take your questions, I must need one thing again to your notice, that be very particular, be very, I would say, firm for the documentation between you and your client. No loose talks, no casual talks. Be very particular. Everything has to be on paper, has to be signed by both, and based on that you move forward. And just the last sentence to conclude, I remember something I read about when written by Narayan Murthy about a relationship between employer and employee. The same analogy can be applied here, in this case for chartered accountant and his client. And I would say that, you do fall in love with your work, but never fall in love with your client, because you never know when your client will stop loving you. So do your work passionately but very carefully. That is what I would say. Now I'll be happy to take the questions. Rahul, I think I finished in time. So
Yeah.
in this, I'll be happy.
There were no queries in the chat box as such.
सागर सर क्वेश्चन एक भी नहीं है सर.
If any participants has any question, they can put down in the chat box.
अभी तक सर एक भी क्वेश्चन आया नहीं है.
We'll wait for a few more minutes.
Sure, we will.
क्वेश्चन डाला सामने से.
Yes, I can see the question. It says every day we come across many alleged dealings in sugar factories, whether such dealings are covered under these acts. So see, particular sugar factories, not just the sugar factories, but the question I think it must be about the ownership and the source of funds utilized to acquire those ownerships. Say for sugar factories, suppose some sugar factories acquired, and what about the value at which the shares were acquired, and from what source the funds came. So usually in such structures, the funds come through such certain company, and that company receives funds again through its parent company. So usually it's holding subsidiary, step down subsidiary structure. So in similar cases, but still, as I said, in Benami Act or PMLA scheduled offenses, the laws are so well defined. If in any case you come across a situation that the consideration is paid by one person and shares are acquired in the name of the other party, then it is going to be exposed to the Benami Act, no doubt about it. I'm to be honest, I cannot comment with respect to any specific sugar factory transaction or any case happening, but yes, there is no exception to such transaction for any company acquisition. There are multiple entities, multiple sources deriving benefit consideration paid, then yes, certain transactions, these will certainly be covered by these economic offenses.
Any other
Overall,
question?
I would say by the time some question will come, yes, I will just mention that, if at all some notice or summons or query comes from any of the authorities, there is nothing to get panicked. I have seen two possibilities. Usually everyone goes running to the authority even before the date in a panicky mode, asking why this notice has come and why is it issued. We are clean, my client is clean, I have nothing to do with it. That is one possibility. And in second, people just avoid and dodge the summons. That's the worst thing. Both things are very bad. You need to sit, you need to strategize, you need to collect the facts, collect the documentation, information. You first need to assess whether you are really exposed to any of these acts. You may come to the conclusion that, I have done maybe, I may have certain exposure to Income Tax Act. I might have used cash for the transaction, which may have some exposure to Income Tax Act. Suppose cash is used to acquire a property or cash is used to acquire a vehicle, car, and notice comes from the Benami unit. So in that case, using the cash, you may be exposed to Income Tax Act to prove the source of that cash. But as long as you don't disown that cash, as long as you keep saying that, this may be my undisclosed income, but still this is my cash, you have no exposure under a Benami Act. So there is nothing to worry or nothing to dodge the summons. So you need to attend, you need to face the proceedings, you need to collect the data, you need to take correct advice. So don't dodge or don't get panicked.
One more question has come.
Yeah, Mr. A gives personal loan to Mr. B, then B invests in his own name and company issues shares to B. Then, okay, a good question. See, again, I will come back to documentation. Here, A has paid consideration to B, rather I would say provided consideration to B, and B has acquired shares of a company. So let us go back to section 29A, two conditions, whether the consideration is provided and whether the person paying consideration, Mr. A, is deriving any benefit out of it. Here, personal loan is given. If that is your contention, then what do you have on hand to show that it is a loan? So if it is a loan, then Mr. A is not interested in the shares purchased by Mr. B. His interest is limited to the repayment of loan. Mr. A lends money to Mr. B as a loan. So Mr. A will be concerned just about repayment of that loan. Mr. A is not concerned about how Mr. B has utilized those funds, whether he has utilized for purchasing shares, property, or whatever he wants to. So in that case, these two transactions are separate. And that is the reason why I have been insisting for the proper documentation to have the loan agreement between A and B to demonstrate that this is just a loan transaction and Mr. A is not bothered what Mr. B has done with the shares. Practically, it may happen that Mr. B may have some information or tip about some share which is going to grow in shorter period, for which Mr. B may take loan from Mr. A, as asked in the question, just to purchase shares of that company. Suppose 100 rupees shares purchased by taking loan from Mr. A, and say after a month's time share is sold for 150, 50 profit made and 100 paid back to Mr. A. In that case, these two are separate transactions. But in order to justify that, you need to have a documentation in place. Otherwise, BPO is always going to take a position that the consideration is provided. So you need to ask questions, but what benefit Mr. A is deriving? Do you have any agreement to that extent saying that the profit will be shared back with Mr. A? But is it a loan? You need to have the loan agreement in place. Then it is not a Benami transaction. I'll take the next question. Many times we come across CITs or higher authorities are held for alleged properties, whether such instances are covered. Yes, in fact, see, CITs, higher authorities, why CITs, higher authorities? Any government servant for that matter is, when they are held for alleged properties, it means that they are public servants under the Prevention of Corruption Act, Section 13(1)(d) of Prevention of Corruption Act. If they are caught red-handed, then Section 7 of PCA comes into picture. And Prevention of Corruption Act is a scheduled offence under PML. So initially proceedings under PC are carried out, and ED proceeds for the disproportionate assets. What the question asked is for alleged properties. It means the disproportionate properties. The properties are very much in size, which are in disproportion to his regular income. Yes, these acts definitely cover. Prevention of Corruption Act covers such cases. These cases happen every day. So these are disproportionate asset cases in case of all the public servants, which includes these government employees as well as politicians and the authorities, enforcement directorate. So these are very much covered. And moreover, when these properties are purchased in the name of someone else, in that case, even the Benami Act comes into picture. Okay, so it looks like if there are no more questions, then we can maybe stop. I'm thankful to WRC for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to interact. Okay. So I think there is another question. If there is only a promissory note along with the check, would it be sufficient evidence for a personal loan? See, not just the check or promissory note. It's not about that. It's about the documentation that justifies that it is a loan transaction. For that, you need to have a loan agreement defining the term. And see, if we are really entering into loan agreement, there has to be some interest element. So there has to be some interest also. Even if it is interest-free loan to a friend, then mention it as this is an interest-free loan for a particular period and repayment is expected on a particular day, on or before a particular day. But there has to be loan agreement as such. Just a promissory note or a post-dated check to take the funds back won't justify it as a loan. There has to be loan agreement in place. Whether CBI has any role in implementation of these acts? See, there are different acts and different regulators for this. So CBI comes under the Delhi Special Police Act. They had the jurisdiction all over India, irrespective of initially only in Delhi, and out of Delhi with permission of states and all, we know whether they are permitted in other states with the approval of the state or without approval of the state. But yes, they are regulators. I would say they are police without jurisdiction. Where police are limited to their jurisdiction, CBI is a police without jurisdiction. But what has happened that most of these acts for which the regulators are like police, CBI, these acts like Prevention of Corruption Act or IPC, for these acts where the money comes into picture, they are scheduled offense. Those sections are scheduled offense under PMLA, for which regulators are enforcement directorate. So practically ED comes into picture because police under the act or IPC or even CBI, they have powers with respect to the punishment, compiling a case to punish the person. Here where the money is involved, how the government is going to recover those funds or confiscate those properties. For that purpose, PMLA is there. See, if you look at PMLA, there is no separate offense as such. All these offenses are covered, are taken together, and blanket power is given under PMLA to enforcement directorate to recover the funds, attach the properties, confiscate the properties. So that is where the distinction between CBI and Enforcement Directorate is there. If Mr. A gives money to Mr. B, both A and B are related to each other, blood relatives, then Mr. B buys a property in his own name using said funds. Mr. A is not a joint owner. Is this a Benami transaction? No. The first sentence of your question, which says if Mr. A gifts money to B and both are relatives, itself says that it is not a Benami transaction. Go back to basics. Section 29A is a payment test. B is a benefit test. So gifting of property may be considered as a payment test, satisfaction of payment test. But is there any benefit? Because gift is out of love and affection, which does not expect anything in return. So there is no benefit derived by the person who gives the property. And when they are blood relatives, then nothing. But there has to be the, of course, I need not tell you, but there has to be a registered gift deed, or at least a gift deed in place to show that it is a gift, with a specific clause saying that this. We typically have a clause that donor does not expect anything in return. It is not a Benami transaction. Can a HUF give loan to Karta for use of that funds in his proprietary? See, again, at a conceptual level, loan is something for the repayment. Have a document in place stating this is loan, there is nothing to worry. Or even HUF gives funds to Karta to acquire property or to do some business in name of HUF, then absolutely no problem. So may, suppose HUF pays, acquires property in the name of Karta, and it is a shop run and income is in the hands of HUF, then it is again not a Benami property. If at all they really want to loan amount to Karta, then there has to be loan agreement in place just to mitigate the risk of Benami.
Seems there is no other question. So
Right.
I would formally like to give a vote of thanks to our speaker today. He explained the provisions quite properly and in a language which is understandable to all. It was brief, but it covered majorly more of the major points. With this small with this small thing, I would request you all to give a round of applause to our today's speaker for a wonderful session. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahul.